Thanks. Thanks, Professor Paul, for being here. And this has been a conversation series for us, and I think it's great having you visiting here us at Amar.
Thank you.
So, for the guys looking at this video, why don't we start with a bit of an introduction about what you studied and what kind of topics you worked on over the years, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay, so I've got an interesting background in a way. I did my PhD at the University of Bristol in the UK in traditional natural product organic chemistry, then moved as an academic to the University of Hull, where I sort of started doing microreactors in the year 2000. And very much at that time, microreactor was the word, it wasn't flow chemistry, where the vision was that you could just parallelize the tiny reactors to make large quantities of compound. The problem is when you start looking at the economics of that, you just need millions of these things in parallel, which isn't economically viable. So as time has gone on, the field has sort of moved from microreactors into flow reactors, where you don't make the channels too big, but you still maintain heat transfer, mixing performance, etc., and can go up into larger scale. And so then in 2013, I moved to Nelson Mandela University in South Africa, very much with the vision to utilize new technology to try to improve the quality of life of people by utilizing new technology to more cost effectively manufacture drugs and things like that.
Oh, great. And I've been seeing some of your papers in the pharma API side. So you've done some stuff about the quality of life, say Africa. Do you want to talk a bit about the African ecosystem? I mean, in the pharma manufacturing space, what's been happening? I mean, are we just importing a lot of drugs? Is the local manufacturing happening? How's it?
So in South Africa, something like 98% of drugs are, or to be more precise, 98% of the APIs are imported. And then we are lucky that there are actually a couple of companies in the country that then formulates the APIs into finished drugs that patients can actually take. But there are other countries on the African continent that have no formulation industry either. So in that case, the only way there that people gain access to drugs is to actually import the finished tablet, obviously at greater cost than even just buying in the API.
But is there a lot of initiatives to start doing more manufacturing in Africa? I mean, the drugs that the poor guys need, people need, do you want to make them locally? Is there?
The answer is yes. Now that's an interesting question, because COVID actually was fantastic in my opinion in one way. And that is that when the planes stopped flying and the ability to ship APIs around the world, etc., stopped, there was very much a drive to do local manufacturing. Unfortunately, people thought that vaccines could solve every single problem in the world. So countries in Africa invested hugely in vaccine manufacturing, which clearly is important and it's one huge step forward. But the drive to really do local API manufacturing has not moved forward hugely. There's momentum to push it forward, but the results are not there yet, which is why I think I need to sort of focus on more and try and drive it towards commercialization.
Got it. Now coming to flow, I mean, you work a lot in the APIs area, right? And so when you see the transition from batch to flow chemistry, a couple of questions. So first, in the petrochemical or refining area, we've been doing flow for ages, for 100 years, right? What caused this interest, I wouldn't say now, but say over the last 10, 15 years in flow in some other domains like pharma? Was the timing right, or were we waiting for a certain innovation in manufacturing, in pumps? Why did flow come to some sectors later than others?
Look, it's interesting. When I started doing this in 2000, everyone always said then, 25 years ago, that the pharma industry would be the first to adopt flow manufacturing. The problem is that all of the processes that they were using had already been approved by the FDA and all of the regulatory bodies. And if they wanted to take a known product and manufacture it in a different way, they'd have had to go back through the regulatory process again.
Yeah.
So consequently, it's probably taken 2 decades for pharma to really utilize the advantages, where I think there are now about a dozen brand new drugs which were manufactured in flow from day one, and they are now on the market and patients can take them that have been manufactured in flow. But from my own personal perspective, working more in the generics industry, the fact that all of these products are already off patent, etc., the key is how can you produce these compounds most effectively and at lower cost. And I think when you attend conferences and see industrialists speaking, it's well established now that if you manufacture a drug in flow, you can probably reduce the cost of manufacturing by 20, 30%, something like that. So obviously in developing countries where access to medicines is a challenge, hopefully if you can produce those compounds, those drugs at a 25% saving, that's a huge amount that could really make a difference.
Got it. So when you approach a pharma process, of course, if it's a highly exothermic reaction, a Grignard, highly toxic reagent, so what is the approach or heuristics that you use? When you approach a process, do you think you do all the sequential steps in flow mode, or do you take more of a surgical approach where, hey, this step, I don't see much of a benefit, let it continue in batch, and let's do certain other steps in flow? I mean, how do you approach the whole problem?
Right, so I think for a very long time, sometimes, and I've done it myself at a conference, you try to sell flow as the world's best invention ever. Let's be realistic, flow isn't perfect for everything. So if 1 or 2 steps in a 10-step API synthesis needs to be done in batch, so be it. As long as overall you can still make a cost saving, it doesn't really matter. The second part of your question, in terms of integration, sometimes people write papers and make it look as if it's literally raw materials in and the final product coming out the other side. There are examples where that has happened, but there are also challenges with that, because each time you join one process to another, you're reducing the concentration along the pathway. So from a cost perspective, it's better off maybe just doing 2 or 3 steps in continuous, stopping the reaction, working it up, and then reconcentrating to make it more cost effective along the pathway. But various options are available on a case.
So that's great, because sometimes at least I sense that if you are, say, a vendor and you want to sell a reactor, sometimes there is the cult of continuous, whereas it has, it's like when you have a hammer, everything shouldn't look like a nail. Part of that, right? It's a great tool, but when you use it at the right spot. But coming to those, there are some obvious ones like highly exothermic or toxic. Are there any other, tips you want to throw for the audiences watching? What's a good target where you say, if you did it batch, it's the plain old way, you're going to save a lot of money or make a much safer process if you switch? Like, what do you look for in a process which makes a good target?
Look, obviously, I'm coming at this from an academic perspective, principally in the first instance. Whenever a project starts, I simply want the student to learn new processes and basically getting it to work. But you need to be open-minded. I many years ago did some consultancy with a pharmaceutical company, and the person I was visiting wanted to do some butyl lithium chemistry in flow. And she was obsessed that the reactor blocked. And I said, why? Well, the lithium salt precipitate. What concentration are you using? I'm using the 2.5 molar butyl lithium straight out of the bottle. Why? Because that's what I do in batch. And I said, but you don't know whether the problem is that the chemistry doesn't work in flow or the concentration is a problem. Play around, do some preliminary research, get the chemistry to work, and once you understand the chemistry, then try to make it commercially viable. So I think what we all have to do is to get more students, more researchers, learning the basics of flow chemistry, ideally in an interdisciplinary way where chemists and chemical engineers are working together, And I'm sure then with the different skill set that you're bringing together, most problems can be solved.
This is fantastic. So, in terms of strategy, if somebody wants to switch a reaction, would you still do first? At what point do you switch? I mean, do you first do some experimentation on the batch mode, learn behavior, what's happening, some kinetics? What's? I mean, I know this is quite generic, but what do you advise?
What we tend to do is always do a quick screen of the reaction in batch, either in traditional batch or even a microwave reactor, get a rough idea of the reactor conditions, and then move to flow.
Okay, that seems to work well. Since you mentioned microwave, now that's another great area. There have been a lot of academic papers on microwave, but when I go to an industrial site, whatever, BSF, when you search, hey, do you have a microwave reactor at scale? Do you know processes which have scaled up, which are using microwaves?
I am not aware of any.
And do you know why? I mean, have we not discovered, or what I struggle to answer myself is, what is a class of reaction? I mean, is the microwave effect indirectly a heat mediated effect, or is there something special going on, and what would be an applicability for that?
I don't believe there's a microwave effect, if I understand the science correctly. I believe it's just a very effective way of getting the heat into a reaction. The problem is you can't scale the reactions. If you've just got a small microwave tube, 1 or 2 centimeters in size, a bit like we put food in a microwave at home, it's easy to get the heat in, but suddenly you make a 1,000 litre reactor, you can't heat it effectively with micro.
So that's been the bottleneck with the micro.
Yeah.
But switching just laterally from the microwave, any thoughts or any experience with things like sonochemistry or electrochemistry, which is possibly more applicable? I mean, have you dabbled in these areas?
I did do some electrochemistry about 10 years ago. When I speak to people in industry where they're still concerned about electrochemical synthesis is fouling of the electrodes, and it would sort of be difficult then to have long-term running reproducible manufacturer in flow. Interestingly, the one that seems to be taking off very successfully is photochemistry, which probably would be scalable in flow, because obviously the light source that you're using, whether it's a traditional light or an LED or whatever, you're putting it on the outside of the reactor. There's never been going to be fouling. So in terms of the green chemistry sort of techniques, I think photochemistry has more chance of success than electrochemistry in a flow environment.
Got it. So when I go on the industrial side, a lot of practitioners, I guess, are still a little lost. Photochemistry has a lot of advantages, but people struggle to see what's a good target reaction. Have you figured that out? I mean, how do you know that here's a reaction I've been doing the plain old way, but maybe I'll get an advantage if I did photo? Is there any metrics?
That's a very good question, and it's something that I was chatting to Amar about earlier on. Is the problem is that we as chemists are not trained in photochemistry and electrochemistry.
Okay.
I could draw a molecule on a piece of paper here and say to any organic chemist in the room, if you reacted that with a base, what would happen? And they would all give me the correct answer. If I say what would happen if you shine light on that molecule, people would look very confused and say they don't know. So certainly it's going to be imperative that if it's going to go forward, probably at university level, students need to be taught synthetic photochemistry and synthetic electrochemistry, because it's a skill that most people don't have.
We still need to develop the abstraction to be able to see where that sort of thing is going to apply. Oh, great. Now, one paradox I see is, people like you on the pharma side have made great advances with flow, and it's no longer a debate about whether flow works. I mean, there's so many syntheses coming out. Then I go to the refineries or petrochemicals, they're using flow. What happens in the intermediate area? Because it seems to work for the very low dollar per kilo molecules. I mean, refining. It works for the very expensive anti-cancer drugs.
Yes.
But then when you come to agrochemicals or a lot of these other sectors still have batch. Of course, they do have flow. Where has the challenge been? Why is this intermediate space a difficult one, or the last one to...
Let me answer your question in a slightly different way. One question that I'm always asked is, why do we not teach flow chemistry more at university level? And the reason is that if you have an organic chemistry teaching lab with 100 students, it's very easy for them to all have a round bottom flask each. It's not quite as easy for them to have a $20,000 flow reactor. Mm-hmm. So it's access to equipment. And in terms of access to equipment, it's a cost of scale issue where if you're only going to use that piece of equipment to manufacture a few grams, in effect, it's a very expensive 5 grams of product. Mm-hmm. But when you look at what's going on in China and India now, where people are manufacturing hundreds of tons per annum in flow, then you can recover your capex cost on the equipment much more effectively. So I think it's an issue of scale. And if you can do it on an industrial scale, it's where stuff is moving now.
But you bring out this issue of the $20,000 reactor and how do you make it scale. Yeah. So one question I have is, like, a lot of academic papers right from the start of micro reactors have been talking about better heat transfer or better shear, better mass transfer and all of that. But from an industrial perspective, since I straddle the area, the capex is a very important factor, right? And a lot of papers, I mean, suppose I got 2x the mass transfer, but your reactor was 10 times as expensive, it's not really great mass transfer for me. And how do you see that? I mean, a lot of the literature or the academic side of presentations don't have much of a reference to capex, but a lot of projects, that's what's going to drive change, right?
I think that's where we need better collaborations between universities and industry. I think I am an academic, so I can criticize them. A lot of the time, you simply want to prove that you can do a new reaction in a different way and simply publish it in a high impact factor journal. What industry is interested in is what can you do that's of a commercial advantage. And I think if industry and academia start working more closely together, I'm sure both parties would learn a substantial amount.
I mean, especially in the Amar context, again, I think that, or a lot of vendors have been trying to show that, hey, I have a better reactor, and where better means a better mass transfer, which is great, if you could have a Guinness Book Award for the best mass transfer in the world. But there's not a lot of focus on, a lot of guys are proudly saying, hey, I have a cheaper reactor. But for a lot of scale up and things like that, I think the capex is what constrains, right? People could go for flow if they had a cheaper reactor.
Absolutely, and especially in the developing economy. It's sort of, if your aim is to make AIDS drugs to improve the quality of life and better access to medicines, you need quality equipment, but you also need cost-effective equipment.
But to as professors, to put that in, one of the advantages of micro especially has been the surface area to volume thing, right? You get much better surface area per unit volume for heat transfer and other things. But when I look at it from a fabrication perspective, it also drives up your material cost, right? Because that same thing plays out. For a certain enclosed volume, you need a lot more steel or a lot more fabrication. But having worked a lot in this area, how are those two effects? I mean, the scaling behavior as you go down, is the higher mass transfer high enough to compensate for capex, or does the capex scale faster? Or I mean, how do you look at it?
That's a very difficult question. And to be honest with you, I don't know if I've got an answer to it, because the problem is, one question that we were chatting about this morning is that all companies will tell you that their reactor has the best mix in, but very few companies actually publish data to show that's the case. And something that I've been saying for a very long time is that people should be more transparent with data to enable end users to be more focused on what technology is right for them.
Got it.
In terms of cost of equipment, of course, that's another problem.
That's not very transparent. You don't know. That's not published.
So if I buy a reactor for $20,000 from a company, I don't know whether that cost them $1,000 to make or $10,000 to make.
Sure.
So But the good thing is there's more and more companies entering the market now, so I think
there's more competition, and that should drive cost down. But when you compare, I mean, this is more again on the academic side. Is there a good test suite? So, for example, if you go to computer science, you're comparing algorithms, right? There are some standard suits, but if you look at mass transfer, heat transfer, and every new vendor that comes, do we have any benchmarks to sort of, because each vendor has interest to showcase his technology is the best. How would you compare different reactors?
A couple of years ago, some of my students did sort of do some fourth-born reactions in a reactor, in a couple of reactors, to sort of get rough ideas of the different performance. But to be honest with you, the way that my students tend to do it these days is to just try something and see if it works. It's sort of, it's as simple as that, to be frank.
So, but when you come to these reactors, and you've yourself been involved in setting up some companies. You want to talk a bit about how that happened? Like, how did you go from an academic to starting a company, and how was it in those days?
So, when I started doing microreactors, as they were at the time, there were no companies that commercially manufactured microreactors.
So you used to do a custom reactor?
So we'd make things ourselves. Okay. And the irony is that at that time, when you try and publish the results, you get severe criticism from referees saying, until you can report chemistry in commercial systems that others can reproduce, this is weak research. Okay. So I developed a collaboration with a company in the Netherlands that was sort of had world-class fabrication facilities in glass. And they then approached the university and said, would you be interested in forming a spin-out company to actually commercialize some of the reactor technology? But the irony now is that sort of 20 years later, you see papers published in high impact factor journals where people have just made a reactor out of a bit of plastic tubing, etc., etc. So how things change in 2 decades. But certainly it's interesting to see it from both an academic and commercial perspective.
Do you think there is a lot of fragmentation? So sometimes when I go to one of the trade shows and you see the Flow Pavilion, right? Yes. There is a lot of new companies with a lot of very unique, or I would say very exotic designs. And I mean, how much of it is escaping patents and novelty for novelty's sake versus, is it sort of a salt? What is the, is it saturation in terms of, is there any free lunch left? Can you really get better mass transfer out there? How do you view all of these designs?
Can you get better mass transfer? Probably. But the question that I ask is, do you actually need it, and at what cost?
Okay.
Yeah, precisely.
Okay. But would commoditization help? Like if there were massive, the way you can get off-the-shelf components, right? And so the same sort of geometry where you're making massive numbers of units rather than do exotic geometries. Would that help, you think? Or?
I think the one thing that would help is standardization. Okay. I remember years ago when the Flow Chemistry Society started, I was on several of the committees. And one idea that was always discussed was to try to bring together the various suppliers to try to standardize fittings and things like that. So it would be easy for me to join my reactor to yours if we want to do multi-step chemistry, etc. Of course, all vendors wanted to keep their own standards. So as a result, that never really happened.
The vendor wants a barrier to switch, whereas we would all allow interoperability. No, that's interesting. I read your 2018 article, I think, about, flow chemistry or where are the challenges, and where we are headed. And 2018 is now 8 years ago. Where are the challenges now? Have things changed, or where do you see for flow chemistry? What are the challenges? What is the thought?
Challenges, so I think the easiest way to answer that question is sort of the questions that you hear most often at conferences. People are obsessed by blocking of the reactors. The good thing now is that sort of several companies have started making reactors that are designed in such a way that you can handle solids. You can even do crystallization where you're making solids in flow, so that problem
is... being able to handle solids.
So solids has always been an issue. The other thing which I still find quite shocking, even though there are several case studies where people have proved that you can make hundreds of tons of product in flow you'll go to a conference and people will say, that's a very interesting reaction, but how do you scale it? And there's examples of this. No, it's not enough information for me to prove that my example is scalable.
Why do people worry about scale? So this, like, coming as an engineer from more the refining area, the largest scale processes are flow, right? So what's the worry? Are they worrying about number up versus scale up and
Yes.
the costing aspect?
Yes, they're worried about that.
Okay. But when you scale some of these, say you have a highly exothermic Grignard reaction, right, where you are using a really small channel because you get a great heat transfer, and then numbering up, of course, works, but makes it expensive. But when you go to larger channels, I mean, there is at some point you become macroscopic and you lose those advantages, right? So
yes.
choosing the optimal size of reactors, is that?
Yes, but of course the other option is I think sometimes people are obsessed that your entire flow reactor path must be the same size.
Okay.
So for instance, if you're doing a multi-step reaction, there's nothing to stop you. Say, imagine the first step is a Grignard reaction where it's very fast, you need very good mixing. At that part, you could use a microreactor type plate to give you really rapid mixing. If the second step is much slower, you could use a 10 millimeter tube or whatever. So people need to be trained, I think, that one size doesn't fit all. And
you need a Swiss Army knife.
Yes.
You can choose the modules and sort of make things as you go. Great. Switching topics a little, I also saw some of the stuff on green chemistry that you sort of dabbled in, and this is a very a polarizing topic, because there are the adherents of green chemistry, and then you come across some experienced veteran who says nothing such as green chemistry, and where do you stand?
Again, sometimes at conferences, academics will always sell flow as being green chemistry. Actually, in some instances, flow can be very unenvironmental, because it links to what we were talking about 5 minutes ago, people's obsession with reactor blocking. One of the easiest ways to prevent a reactor blocking is to use very, very dilute reaction conditions. But if you use very dilute reaction conditions, you're going to use 10 times the amount of solvent, etc., etc. So not everything in flow is green. However, I strongly believe that as part of all of the tools that are available, flow can help you become green in many, many ways. If you're able to handle slurries and do reactions at very, very high concentration, then you will use less solvent. If you can do your reaction in very high selectivity and produce less byproducts, the amount of energy and solvent that you're going to use to do your purification process will be less. So I believe that when you really understand your process and you can optimize it, in the vast majority of instances, it will make it greener.
Got it. So moving beyond flow, though, when you look at green chemistry, right, and a lot of industrial decisions are, say, driven by cost, whether it's OPEX or CAPEX, right?
Yeah.
So in some cases, green aligns with that, right? You've just not discovered a reagent, now you have a great heterogeneous catalyst, it all makes economic sense, and then it works. But in cases where they are not aligned, right, so there is a route which is greener but a little more expensive, you see the industry adopting it? I mean, is green just better economies which are better? Like, how do you see that? If you have something which is green but expensive, does that go ahead?
I suspect not.
Okay.
To be frank, I don't know what your opinion is. You look at what's going on in some countries at the moment, and green is not necessarily a terribly trendy topic. So, and I doubt many companies around the world would do something unless it's more cost effective.
Right. So green for green's sake doesn't really sell very well unless you can make a display.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So coming to reaction classes, sometimes I come across situations where, say, it's a single phase reaction, right?
Yeah.
And these sort of targets, to judiciously apply flow, if it's a two-phase system or highly exothermic, it works well. But for a single-phase reaction, for example, can you get still some advantages from flow, or in those cases, the batch to flow?
Very much so. Like, and a couple of advantages would include you can do reactions at much higher temperature and pressure, so then you can massively reduce the residence time. Often by doing that, you then improve the selectivity of the reaction, so you're going to get the reaction in a higher yield, which would also simplify the purification processes. So yes, I believe overall that whether it's biphasic or single phase, you can still really make a flow process more advantageous.
For example, in the single phase case, I often see a reaction which is developed by the chemist in the lab, and he's using a glass flask.
Yeah.
So he's doing it in atmospheric mode. He didn't even think of raising temperatures beyond, right? So a lot of flow, does it have to parallel process intensification? I mean, you get the real advantages of flow if you're trying to push the envelope on temperature, pressure.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like I've done some reactions with azides, for example, which are explosives. So traditionally in a batch reactor, you would do the reaction at room temperature. In flow, you can go up to 200 degrees centigrade and do it safely. Then reaction times will come down by several orders of magnitude because of the sort of real process intensification. So yes, very much so.
So the coupling intensification and reaction. And where does the limit set in? I mean, sometimes when you increase temperature, is it effective? See, you could boost rates a lot if you went from whatever 80 degrees to say 150 degrees. But in your sort of cases, where is it selectivity, product degradation? Where do you stop in terms of it? Because the reactors could take tremendously high pressures, right?
Yes.
Is it the pumps? So what point do you normally say, okay, this is high enough for temperature and pressure?
Now, product degradation is an interesting one, because you may find, for example, that if you did the reaction in batch at 150 degrees centigrade for several hours, you'd get degradation. But through process intensification, if the reaction is only 5 minutes instead of several hours, you may not get the product degradation, for example. So in terms of limits, we've never really done chemistry much over about 200 degrees centigrade. At the moment, most commercial equipment used in that sort of space doesn't go much higher than that. There are some examples going up to about 250. Would it be worth trying to see if you could take it a bit higher and reduce residence times further? Possibly.
So you're mainly limited by the equipment and the engineering limitations. I mean, in terms of boosting rates, typically you don't have an inherent degradation or a selectivity reason why you're not.
And of course, in the larger systems in flow chemistry, you tend to use the heat transfer fluids to control the temperature, and a lot of those which originate in batch reactors don't go much over 200 degrees centigrade. So you'd probably need innovative technology to get the temperature up higher as well, I suspect.
So since you work at, when I see the number of APIs you worked on, from anti-diabetics to so you work with a large class of reactions. So what does your toolkit look like? I mean, in your lab, I mean, if somebody wants to have a pretty versatile R&D lab, right, that can screen, and from the next reaction, you have a corrosive, you may have a solid, right? What do you look for? What are the sort of bits and pieces you would advise somebody to have?
Look at, I've now been in South Africa for 13 years. I've got all sorts of equipment in the lab, from tiny Chemtrix microreactors, which have a volume of 10 microliters. We've got a lot of the little things, reactor plates, which are sort of iPhone-size reactors that have volumes of a few milliliters. Students will also use bits of plastic tubing, just to optimize reaction conditions how they think is best. In terms of scale up then, we've got a Chemtrix kiloflow reactor, which we've demonstrated multi-kilogram scale with. We've just got one of the Amar reactors suitable for handling slurries in flow. And this is quite important, because when you're trying to persuade funders and government that flow is a feasible solution, it's one thing telling someone that you can scale up using it, but they want to physically see that yesterday you actually made that bottle over there of 5 kilograms in it, and it works. So you've got to be able to demonstrate.
So nothing like getting a significant quantity to boost the confidence of external guys. What about downstream separations and workup? I mean, have you focused a lot on reactions, or is there a lot of continuous stuff also happening in the workup, crystallization, distillation?
We are focused mainly on the chemistry. In terms of workup, the most common thing we do is develop a sort of precipitation type method, so the effluent coming out of the reactor will immediately just drip into an anti-solvent and crystallize as a small batch reactor. With reaction workup, we've got membrane separators, things like that. Again, the Amar equipment not only is suitable for handling slurries as a reaction mixture, actually enables you potentially to do crystallization in flow as well. So that adds another tool to the plethora of equipment that's available.
Does analysis sort of put a spanner in the works? I mean, a lot of analysis is still draw a sample and take to the HPLC, or are you doing a lot of PAT, inline, FTIRs? How's that working?
We do both. Now, it's interesting because what I and many others speak about for years is that the advantage of flow chemistry is that you can do more reactions per day, which is true. However, the challenge is you've got to monitor all of those reactions that you collect. So for a very long time, the most common thing was simply collecting samples in vials and then leaving them on the GC or HPLC parallel overnight. Now you're absolutely right. More and more people are developing inline approaches using just a UV detector or a flow IR type system. And so, yes, we do use online, but that's really more and more important in terms of large-scale manufacturing, in terms of proving consistent, reproducible manufacture, not just over an hour, but over weeks potentially. You really need to know that you are doing quality, consistent manufacturing.
Got it. Very, very interesting. I think I'm sure our audiences have learned a lot from this. Any last words of advice for somebody? See, there's a significant number of people still looking at flow cautiously from the sidelines, wondering whether to jump it, or is this the next hype? Every decade brings something. What are some thoughts, some parting messages?
I would say just give it a go. Most people that I've chatted to over the last 20 years have sort of said, I was a bit reluctant to give it a go. I was trained in batch chemistry. It's the way I learned all of my skills. I knew what to do. But most people say, not suitable for absolutely everything, but this technology has helped us solve some problems that we couldn't have solved elsewhere. So
just dip your feet in the water, give it a go.
Absolutely.
I think it was a great conversation. I learned a lot, and I enjoyed it. And thanks, Paul, again for being a part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.